Next speaker this afternoon is Kairos Shen, who is the Chief Planner for the Boston Redevelopment Authority. And most of you know the BRA is Boston's Economic Development and Planning Agency. And what Kairos will be addressing is a similar topic, what the City of Boston is doing to assess vulnerability, to plan for it, and then how to guide and control development to be resilient to climate change impacts. Kairos.
Thank you. I think it's following after New York, so I planned a comparison. So Dan, I think maybe this presentation is going to highlight the difference between being hit by Sandy and nearly hit by Sandy, to the extent that our thinking is probably not as advanced and in what you just saw New York getting to, because I think clearly, for a lot of people, it's just assumed that Boston will stay lucky, although that's an assumption that we cannot, count on. So I'd like to step back a little bit. I wanted to just make a comparison because in a way, what the city of Boston has been doing in the last 30 years in terms of our planning has been all about reclaiming our place as a waterfront city. So if you look on the left, that's the 800 some odd acres of the Central Park. And if you overlay it, it's almost exactly the same size as the Inner Harbor. Now, it's important because the most important planning projects and public infrastructure investments that we have made in the city in these last 30 years is about cleaning the harbor, $4.5 billion worth of investment, federal funds. Fred is supposed to make the next presentation. He'll talk about the MWRA's role in cleaning the harbor. But the notion here is that the harbor can be reclaimed as a center of the city, a recreational center, a psychological and center for us as a waterfront city. I think, of course, the next part, of course, is about the submersion of the highway system. Earlier on, Steve Miller talked about the Central Artery Tunnel project. It was really a project that primarily about reclaiming, again, the connection to the harbor of the waterfront from the downtown, which was cut, or there was a barrier created when the Central Artery elevated highway project was done. And then you can see these green lines, which are the extension from the inner part of the Shawmut Peninsula out to reconnect to the water. Now, if you followed some of the discussion that's occurred in the papers locally, the question is sort of the same question you asked Steve earlier on, like, did we not think about seawater rise when we were doing all these projects? And I think that the notion of really the power of reconnecting to the water and what it could mean for the city was so important that I guess we had underestimated the threat that the water now will pose for our city. And even though we did plan for sea level rise, I think what we're learning is that we're learning that in fact that the effects are much worse than what we had anticipated. So this is a kind of planning irony. So the question is, how do we now take all of the 40 years worth of investment that reconnects us to the harbor and now reassess our position? And as I said, the newspapers would say, you bunch of fools, we shouldn't have been building in this area, and all the investments that we've made to the South Boston waterfront and the downtown really is not the kind of investment that we should have made. So effectively, I think from a planning perspective here in Boston, it is changing our conception to the water. Now, Dan already talked about this notion in New York that you have to think about not just being at the water, but being wet. So it's not, it's like having kids when you go to the beach. You can't just hang out and sunbathe, you have to get wet. And that the notion of what you bring to the beach with kids and getting wet is entirely different than you were just going there to watch and hang out at the beach. Now, this, of course, is the overlay of the 1760 shoreline of the Shawmut Peninsula. And you can see most of Boston is reclaimed land. In fact, we are in MIT over here, right here, is also part of this reclaimed land. And the question is, if in fact that the worst storm and sea level continues to rise, and I'll show another map that shows the level of inundation that our city will experience with a major storm, would be that we eventually go back to the original landform, the original geography of this area. Now, Dan's already mentioned, and I'm not going to go into detail, that sea level rise is just one component, and it turns out our numbers are not so different from yours, 1 to 2 feet to 2050. Our thinking and projection, which again we don't trust, to 2100 is about 3 foot to 5 foot, and yours was 2 to 4 feet. But again, the science is showing that in fact that it's too hard for us to look that far out into the future. And then of course there's the higher temperature heat waves, and then probably most important in terms of a planning perspective is the a greater likelihood of disruptions that we take for granted that our city provides. So the notion of unpredictable weather patterns causing disruptions to energy, mobility, and all kinds of other things that we take for granted in the city. Now, I've already talked about the fact that there's sort of, in our thinking about adaptation and change, and again, I would say, not to the level that Dan has been describing in terms of specifics, but here in Boston, we are targeting people's change in attitude. I talked about the change attitude in relationship to the water as a conceptual and existential idea. The other thing is that clearly we have to change people's behavior patterns and business operations in particular. And then only third are we talking about the kinds of physical transformations that are necessary. So this map shows the inundation on the bottom right-hand corner. You can begin to see the colors, the number of the areas that would be inundated depending on the level of storm surge. And I just want to talk briefly about a few things that we're doing in terms of the actions that we're taking. Again, in more general terms than you heard just before. So the first is really assessing the vulnerabilities, such as these kinds of maps that begin to show sort of the flooding, the degree of flooding that we would see. We are in the midst in Boston right now of the appeal period, the 3-month appeal period for the FEMA maps. I don't know, I didn't look at the full agenda of this conference and don't know whether there's a section devoted to this. Dan already mentioned their work with FEMA in getting the maps right, because there's so many things that hinges on the maps being right, because there are requirements, insurance, and all of that will come from the FEMA maps. One thing we're learning is that we've hired our own consultants to actually review the FEMA maps. There is a lot of flaws, perhaps, in the way that FEMA treats their modeling right now, and the important thing is to get at least that part right. But what we tell people, of course, is that FEMA is only a record based on what has happened up till now. It doesn't, in fact, take into account any of the climate change that we know that is going to happen. So FEMA is backward-looking, and of course, FEMA allows the city to take some additional buffer in terms of the protection that we would give in terms of inundation. Now, I talked about the disruptions to energy and mobility, and in terms of energy, the city has started this effort around eco-districts, which is about thinking about more broadly district-wide kinds of resiliency, and in particular in the energy infrastructure. We have started, we have actually contracted and we're doing a citywide energy plan that looks at future demand of energy in our city and seeing whether there's a match to the kind of local energy production that could be provided within these centers of growth. The notion here is that we want to build a more resilient energy system that will, again, make us more resilient and be able to bounce back if we were to suffer from any disruptions. And then in terms of operations, we are now trying to get developers and people who own buildings and operate buildings to actually be aware of that they are vulnerable and that actually begin to review their operations. Now, in particular, the BRA is responsible in the city for managing and permitting private development. And one of the things that we started to institute last year was this what we called climate adaptation checklist, so that any developer now developing a building larger than 20,000 square feet, when they come to the city and submit what is called a project notification form, the first thing they receive from our agency now is a checklist. It's a very simple checklist, which simply starts by saying, is your building in a vulnerable location from climate change? And the first, it's a yes or no answer. And if they tick off no, presumably they don't have to go through any of the additional questions. But the notion is that many developers and many landowners actually are simply not aware of the fact that they're vulnerable. And then it goes through a series of questions about, hey, if you know you're vulnerable, what are the data that you're using to assess your vulnerability? The next question is, do you have a professional on your team to advise you on climate resiliency and adaptation? And so those kinds of things, and what we started to do is to actually begin to use this checklist of understanding the areas of knowledge or lack of knowledge in our development community. So that, obviously the paper has been asking, well, the mayor, when are you going to actually adopt some serious regulations around this? And I think that what we're saying to folks is that we're trying to assess what people know and what they don't know before we actually start making regulatory changes to mandate, let's say, resiliency. We are going to, I think we're modeling this after the way the city adopted its green building zoning regulations, which is that we did a year worth of where we asked the developers to fill in the lead checklist. And that after the year, and we started to see what actually building owners and developers and architects know, that at the end of that year, at the end of 1 year of this adaptation checklist, that we would have a better idea what are the areas that we need to change in our permitting regulations. In terms of the development review process, we have started to actually include resiliency as a kind of performance standard that our reviewers actually would include. So even though we don't have regulations around it, when a project is submitted to us, we actually look at the location of their core infrastructure, so that increasingly we're not simply not approving buildings that have their generators in the basement if they're in a vulnerable area. We're making sure that, for instance, that questions like, how long can you operate if you didn't have electric connection to your building? All of that are part of our review process, and we've adopted it by essentially changing our procedures in the redevelopment authority and our permitting process. And then, of course, the question about temporary and permanent features that are actually part of the permitting process. For the first time, for instance, we are getting one building owner that is looking for temporary barriers for flooding or for high tide kinds of situation. And then the question about that is, would we put them through the normal permitting process? And there, in some cases, the requirement for them to get rights from the public, such as sidewalks and so on, in order to execute those things. We're beginning to see those kinds of proposals, and we're going to work with the new administration now to figure out how we can streamline those permits instead of going through the normal process. Now, another thing about understanding adaptation is that the city is starting to work now with coastal zone management, and this is a project that we're going to launch in the fall, which is this notion that we are going to take 3 different areas, each susceptible to seawater rise and, of course, climate change, and use them as prototypes for design analysis or piloting design approaches, not unlike the Rebuilt by Design that the federal government started to pilot with New York City. And the notion here is to take 3 different locations. One is a historic or a building within a historic location in the city in the North End, And then another one would be in what we call the 100 acres area north of Gillette and in the south of the 19th century warehouses in Fort Point. And an area that has been planned but not yet built. And then third is the area right by Columbia Point, Morrissey Boulevard. Those of you who live around Dorchester know that this is already an area that if you know that high tide is coming, you avoid Morrissey Boulevard because it's frequently flooded already. But this is an area where we're focusing on the kinds of transformation and design transformation that can occur on public infrastructure elements that are not just owned by one entity, right? By the state and by the city, and in this case, some of the ownership also belongs to the University of Massachusetts. And the question about how we would design infrastructure in that kind of scenario to make it more resilient is the goal. Here, of course, is like looking at long-term planning elements and design of open space systems that could become part of the green infrastructure that actually moderates the impact of storms. And then a lot of the city stock is not unlike the one that we picked in the North End, which are historic structures that, again, is about retrofitting existing buildings. Now, in terms of, this is our inner harbor, and we've been focusing about this area. Obviously, the big question is there a single silver bullet? And this is an idea that has been floated. Of course, Dan talked about this notion of building a continuous levee, and many of you know that our harbor islands, if you link them and built a dam, this could protect the inner harbor. And of course, it's not so far-fetched. Some of these ideas have been around for a long time. And in London, with the Thames project, and of course, the Moses project in Venice have tried these. Now, they're incredibly large infrastructure projects, and I've said that this plan was conceived at the same time that we got the Central Artery Tunnel project funded. And that's when we thought the Central Artery Tunnel project, well, we sold it as a $2.2 billion project. It's now not counting financing costs, it's about $15 billion. And when we look at a solution like that, we know that the likelihood that Boston would get this kind of funding, since we have already gotten more than our fair share, presumably, is impossible. So I want to echo what Dan said earlier, that there isn't the single solution to solve this problem. And so we've been increasingly trying to get people to understand that distributing the responsibility to individuals and to building owners and to individuals and individual homeowners actually is the way to go. So in a way, it is the power of the many, and that in fact, it's much more nimble. You know, this is not unlike the Maginot Line that, of course, the French built to protect them against the Germans. You didn't think that was funny, huh? Okay. Not that I would say that we're not as French as the French, but that the ocean is certainly more systematic than the Germans ever will be. But the notion here is to distribute the responsibility so that there is both the private and public funding, the notion of figuring out how to have new business models, to use market forces to figure out how to solve some of these problems. And then, of course, framing it as a potential business opportunity for folks, I think is an important one. Now, one more important thing, and this thought I would leave you with, is that government is typically not very good at assessing our policies. So one of the things is, as we go into this will really test our normal way of doing business. It's not a simple set of regulations that we can determine what we need to do now and then implement it through our bureaucracy. But that we have to figure out how we can continually assess whatever regulations that we put in place, how can we keep adapting it and changing it? Because I think the notion that we all accept now is that the change and the climate change itself and the impact of it is not yet fully known to us. And I think that the most important thing for us is to figure out how we can abandon policies that don't work, but also keep innovating and keep trying to implement innovative ideas from the public side and to encourage the private to come along with us. So I'll leave you with that thought. And you know, if we were lucky enough to receive additional funding from the federal government, we certainly won't be doing this particular project. So I look forward to continuing this conversation in the panel. Thank you very much.